In the autumn of 1862, a parcel from America arrived in the small town of Roquemort in the south of France, on the right bank of the Rhône. Inside were a few grapevine cuttings, an ordinary botanical curiosity of the kind being posted across the Atlantic by the dozen in those years. The man who received them was a local merchant named Borty. He was not a scientist. He was not a smuggler. He was simply a man who wondered how an American vine would behave in French soil. He planted the cuttings in his small, walled garden and presumably showed them off to his neighbors. A year later, his neighbors' vines began to yellow. First the leaves, then the shoots, then the roots, which crumbled into rot when you dug them up. Nobody understood what was happening. Growers burned sulfur, flooded their fields, commissioned masses, put up roadside crosses, buried a live toad beneath each vine to draw the poison from the ground. None of it worked. The blight moved down the Rhône Valley, then through the Languedoc, then through Bordeaux, and then further, over the Pyrenees, over the Alps, into Champagne, into Crimea, into Australia. By the end of the century, France had lost, by various estimates, around 40% of all its vineyards, close to 2.5 million acres. Whole departments that produced nothing but wine went bankrupt within a single generation. People emigrated, villages emptied. A way of life 2,000 years old ended in roughly 25 years because of a parcel one curious man opened in his back garden. And this was not a freak accident. This was the pattern. Because wine is not simply a drink. It is one of the most fragile and at the same time most political things human beings have ever produced. People were traded for it. Kings rewrote laws over it, and emperors ordered other men's fields cut down because of it. Maritime empires were built on it, and it quietly poisoned the Roman aristocracy with lead. It has been currency, medicine, antiseptic, tax, dowry, and the blood of a god, sometimes all at once in the same jar. The thing that now sits in a supermarket aisle between the mineral water and the laundry detergent, costing less than a cinema ticket, was once the reason armies crossed mountains and entire nations reshaped themselves to get hold of it. So how did the fermented juice of a crushed berry become the most political drink in human history? And what have we forgotten opening a bottle on a Friday night? But this story doesn't start in Roquemort. It doesn't even start with a human being. It starts millions of years before the first winemaker, in the body of an ancestor we share with the apes, who picked up an overripe fruit off the ground and did not die. Here's the thing to understand at the outset. Wine was not invented. Wine happens by itself. On the skin of every ripe grape live wild yeasts. The berry splits under its own weight from a bird's beak from the fall off the vine. The juice runs out, the yeasts meet the sugar, and within a few days that little puddle contains alcohol. No technology is required, only grapes and time. Which means fermented fruit existed in nature long before there was anyone capable of appreciating it. And here the biology explains everything that follows. Around 10 million years ago, an ancestor common to humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas underwent a mutation in the gene for one enzyme, alcohol dehydrogenase. It made the breakdown of ethanol dozens of times more efficient. Put plainly, our ancestors came down from the trees onto the forest floor, where overripe fallen fruit lay rotting, and those who could digest slightly fermented food gained access to calories that were closed to everyone else. We literally evolved toward the ability to drink. Humans did not find alcohol. Alcohol found us, long before we were human. Then comes a second reason, far more mundane. Water killed people. Until the late 19th century, before anyone understood germs or built treatment systems, the water in any sizable settlement was a lottery. It carried dysentery, cholera, typhoid. Wine did not. Alcohol and acidity made it biologically dead, It kept for months and years where water spoiled in days. It was added to doubtful water to disinfect it. It was used to wash wounds by Roman legionary surgeons and by field surgeons in the Napoleonic Wars alike, and used as medicine because there was nothing else. And third, grapes ripen once a year and rot in days. Wine locks an entire summer of sunlight inside a clay vessel and lets you take it out again in February. Calories that do not spoil. A harvest you can carry across a sea in exchange for metal, cloth, weapons, people. A jar of wine is not a drink. It is a savings account you can pour. So when we talk about wine, we are not talking about taste. We are talking about survival, about storing wealth, and about power over something a society cannot function without. And the first people who understood that lived in the South Caucasus 8,000 years ago. Gata Gora is a low hill about 30 miles south of modern Tbilisi, in a valley where cattle now graze. Around 6000 BC, there was a village here of round mud brick houses covering roughly 2.5 acres. The people who lived in them were still using tools of stone and bone, and they were making wine on what was, for the period, an industrial scale. An international team led by the molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern published results in PNAS from the chemical analysis of residue on potsherds from this hill and from neighboring Shulaveris Gora. The clay held tartaric acid, a compound that in these quantities occurs in this region only in the Eurasian grape and in wine made from it, along with malic, citric, and succinic acids. The dating, roughly 6,000 to 5,800 before Christ. That is 600 to 1,000 years older than the previous record from the Zagros mountains of Iran. But the most telling thing here isn't even the chemistry. The vessels holding the residue are enormous. The largest held around 80 gallons. They have narrow bases, so a jar cannot stand upright on its own, meaning they were buried in the earth up to the neck. Exactly as Georgians still do today with qvevri, the clay vessels in which wine ferments beneath an earthen floor. And on the outside, the pottery carries applied decorations in the shape of grape clusters. These people decorated their wine jars with a picture of what went inside them. Note that detail because it explains everything that follows. 80 gallons is not a private pleasure. It is a store for a community, for a feast, for exchange, for ritual. 8,000 years ago, wine was already not a beverage, but a social institution. And since the grape was, by all appearances, already being domesticated and propagated from cuttings, people were willing to reshape the landscape for it. From there, the vine moved south. In the Zagros Mountains, at the Iranian site of Haji Firuz Tepe, jars were found with residue from roughly the 5th millennium BC, together with terebinth resin, added as a preservative and probably a flavoring. The first wine additives appear almost simultaneously with the first wine. And in Armenia, in the cave of Areni Odin, archaeologists uncovered what is called the oldest known winery, around 4100 BC. A clay treading platform survives, with a channel running into a sunken vat, along with grape seeds, dried vines, and the remains of pressed skins. All of it worked on a scheme any modern winemaker would recognize. Crush, collect the juice, let it ferment in a vessel. And here is the detail that unsettles. The winery at Areni sat among burials. In the same cave, in the same layers, graves, including children's, and vessels containing human remains. Wine was made in a room that was also a cemetery. We do not know what that meant to them, but it is the first time wine and death appear in the same frame, and far from the last. A red liquid that looks like blood alters consciousness and does not spoil when everything else does, was almost bound to become the substance for speaking to the dead. Long before anyone said the words, "This is my blood," wine stood beside the grave. Then the vine traveled to a place where wine could not grow at all, Egypt. In the Nile Valley, the climate was wrong, and the first Egyptian wine was imported. At Abydos, in the tomb of a ruler conventionally called Scorpion I, around 3150 BC, archaeologists found some 700 jars, roughly 1,200 gallons, all of it brought from the Levant, hundreds of miles by sea and land, to be buried with a dead king. 1,200 gallons of heavy pottery hauled across half a country, not for a feast of the living, but as a ration for the afterlife. Later, the Egyptians learned to grow the vine themselves in the delta and the oases, and built a bureaucracy around it that would make a modern sommelier sweat. Jars were inscribed in hieroglyphs with the regnal year of the pharaoh, the name of the vineyard, the name of the owner, and the name of the man responsible for quality, which is to say, vintage, appellation, estate, and winemaker. Jars carrying exactly those inscriptions were found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. One of them reads, "Year 5, the vineyard of the house of Aten," and a winemaker named Ka. That is a genuine wine label, more than 3,000 years before anyone coined the word. And notice who it was for. In Egypt, wine was drunk by priests, officials, and the royal family. Ordinary people drank beer. From the beginning, wine was a marker. If what is in your cup is wine, rather than cloudy barley mash, you stand on the other side of a social line. It has never lost that function. For wine to become genuinely global, though, it needed a fleet, and it got one. The Phoenicians, Tyre, Sidon, Byblus, built a trading network from Lebanon to Spain, and wine was among its principal goods. They shipped it in pointed amphorae stacked in the hole with one wedged into another, the first standardized shipping container in history. They also appear to have been the first to float a layer of olive oil on the wine to cut off the air and stop it turning to vinegar. But what really changed the world was not that they shipped wine. It was that they shipped the vine, planting vineyards wherever they found it a trading post. Cyprus, Sicily, North Africa, Spain. Their Carthaginian successors turned it into a science. After Carthage was destroyed, the Romans judged Mago's treatise on agriculture so valuable that they had it translated into Latin, even as they erased the city itself. The Greeks did the same thing further north. Around 600 BC, settlers from Phocaea in Asia Minor founded a colony on the southern coast of Gaul called Massalia, today Marseille. And along with the city, they brought the vine and wine to sell. The local Celts lost their minds over it. They did not dilute it with water as the Greeks did. They drank it neat, and according to ancient authors, they would pay almost any price for it. Diodorus Siculus left one line on the subject that runs cold. The Gauls would give one slave for one jar of wine, a serving boy for an amphora. That is not a pretty metaphor about liquid gold. It is a literal exchange rate, a human being for a container of fermented juice. And it is the first time in this story, though nowhere near the last, that wine is bought with people. The Greeks themselves considered such drinking barbaric and built an identity on it. Among them, drinking wine undiluted meant being a savage. A civilized man mixed it with water in a large vessel called a crater and drank it in company at a symposion, a word that literally means drinking together. No solitary intoxication. The symposion was an institution with a master of ceremonies who set the strength of the mixture, an order of speaking, music, argument. Plato's symposium takes place at exactly such a gathering, and the dialogue on the nature of love unfolds precisely because the participants have agreed to go easy that night. Behind all this stood a god the Greeks feared perhaps more than any other. Dionysus arrives from outside, from the east, with a crowd behind him. He gave ecstasy and stripped away social roles. At his festivals, the lines between slave and master, man and woman, human and animal, dissolved. But he had a second face. In Euripides' Bacchae, King Pentheus refuses to recognize the new god and is torn apart by his own mother, who in her frenzy does not recognize her son. The Greeks understood something about wine that we prefer to forget. It does not simply relax people. It removes the brakes a society runs on, and it does that job equally well for a celebration and for a catastrophe. Which is why they had rules for dilution, a master of the feast, and a myth about what happens when the god of wine is not respected. And then came Rome, which turned sacred madness into industry. The Romans did not invent winemaking, they scaled it. By the 1st century AD, wine was being produced in Italy the way steel would be produced 2,000 years later, with return on investment calculations, a workforce housed in slave barracks, logistics, standardized containers, and brand names. The agronomist Columella works out how many years it takes a vineyard to pay for itself and concludes that with proper care, it beats grain. The villas around Pompeii were not holiday homes, but factories, presses, cisterns, rows of buried clay jars. Wine was decanted into stamped amphorae and shipped to Gaul, to Britain, to the Black Sea. Beside the hill of Monte Testaccio in Rome, there still stands a mound, the height of an 8-story building, made entirely of broken shards from containers unloaded at the city's docks. And something appeared here that neither Egypt nor Greece had, a cult of great vintages. The most legendary was the Opimian from BC, named after the consul of that year. People were still drinking it and boasting about it more than a century later, when it had turned into a bitter sludge that had to be cut with young wine. Pliny the Elder grumbles about that snobbery and almost the terms used today about collectible Bordeaux. And where there is serious money, the state appears. In AD 92, the Emperor Domitian issued an edict: no new vineyards in Italy, and up to half the existing vineyards in the provinces, including Britain, to be cut down. The official reason was a grain shortage. Too much land had gone over to the vine, and there was not enough to eat. The real reason, in the view of many historians, was protecting Italian producers from Gallic and Spanish competition. The provinces resisted, the edict was enforced badly, and nearly 200 years later, the Emperor Probus revoked it. This is the first recorded instance of a central government ordering other people's vineyards destroyed for the sake of its own economy. It will not be the last. 15 centuries later, the Spanish crown will do the same thing in the Americas. And now the chapter where the history of wine stops being about trade. Roman wine would have been, to our palates, almost indistinguishable from spoiled, sour, often bitter, frequently already turning. They corrected it with whatever came to hand: seawater, resin, herbs, honey. And the favorite way to soften and sweeten wine was a syrup boiled down from great must. Reduced by half, it was defrutum. Reduced to a third, sapa. The problem was the cookware. Columella advises explicitly, boil it in lead vessels, not bronze, because bronze imparts a coppery taste and ruins the flavor. He was entirely right about the flavor. He had no idea what was happening chemically. Acidic must reacts with lead to produce lead acetate, a compound that genuinely tastes sweet on the tongue. Alchemists would later name it exactly that: sugar of lead. Laboratory reconstructions suggest such a syrup can carry anywhere from 200 to 1,000 milligrams of lead per liter. The syrup went into the wine, and the wine was drunk daily, by the pint. In the Roman recipe collection attributed to Apicius, these syrups appear in dozens of dishes. Lead does not kill quickly. It accumulates in the bones, in the blood, and takes years to dismantle a person from the inside. Colic, anemia, gout, infertility, disturbed sleep, irritability, clouded thinking. Roman physicians described these symptoms precisely and at length. They simply did not connect them to what was on the table. There is a famous theory that lead poisoning brought down the Roman Empire. It is more honest to say that researchers still argue about the doses and about which source mattered most, the syrups, the pipes, or the lead patches on cracked vessels. No single substance killed an empire. But the fact stands, the most refined element of the Roman table carried a slow neurotoxin for generations, and the richer you were, the more of it you got. Remember that mechanism. Wine will be improved with poison again, including in the 20th century. The empire fell, but the vine was saved by something the Romans never planned. In the 4th century, Christianity became the state religion, and in its central sacrament, wine is not a symbol or a decoration, but a required element. Without bread and wine, there is no Eucharist, which means wine has to exist wherever there is a church, always, even if there is war, plague, and ruin outside. That saved viticulture in Europe. While cities collapsed and roads grew over, the vine went on living at monasteries and cathedrals because it was a liturgical necessity. To say Mass in cold Germany or in England, you planted vines there. And in the 7th century, a second force appeared that decided the opposite. Islam prohibited intoxicants, and across an enormous territory from Spain to Persia, winemaking either vanished or retreated into Christian and Jewish communities, or converted to raisins and vinegar. The paradox is that it was Arab scholars who perfected distillation and gave the world the word alcohol, from alcohol. The technology on which brandy, port, and the entire fortified half of this story would later be built was refined precisely where drinking was forbidden. Look at a map of winemaking today, and you are looking at a map of religious allegiance from 1,000 years ago. The northern boundary runs where the grape stops ripening. The southern and eastern boundary runs where Islam arrived in the 7th century. Wine stopped being merely a commodity. It became a border between civilizations. Inside Christian Europe, the principal winemakers became monks, and they turned a craft into a science. Especially the Cistercians in Burgundy, an order whose rule required them to live by their own labor. They had what nobody else had: time, literacy, and continuity. A monastery does not die and does not divide its property among heirs. Records are kept for centuries. And they noticed something nobody before them had systematized. The same variety, planted the same way, on a plot 100 paces long gives different wine. More stone here, clay there, this slope facing east, that one collecting the morning fog. The legend that Burgundian monks tasted the soil itself is most likely a charming invention. That they kept observations for years and mapped their plots by quality is historical record. This is where the idea underpinning the entire modern culture of wine was born: terroir. The notion that flavor is not the achievement of the winemaker, but the voice of a particular piece of ground. In 1110, the Cistercians received land at Vougeot, and century by century walled it in with stone. Clos de Vougeot, the enclosed plot of Vougeot, still exists, and its boundaries have barely shifted in 900 years. Notice this: almost everything sold today as timeless French tradition was invented by monks who had taken a vow of poverty. The most expensive bottles on earth grow on ground mapped out by men who were not permitted to own anything. Which brings us to a country that most people would not put in a wine documentary at all, because England was a wine country too. Not as a joke, and not for a single warm decade. The Romans planted vines in Britain. Pollen analysis confirms viticulture in the south of the island, and Domitian's edict of A.D. Devanosted, which named Britain among the provinces to be cut back, only makes sense if there were something there to cut. In the 8th century, Bede wrote that the island produced vines in places. Vineyards appear in Anglo-Saxon documents and in the laws of King Alfred. Then came Tisica Shestisiat Shest, and with the Normans came French abbots, monks who knew how to grow grapes, and a nobility for whom wine was a daily requirement rather than a treat. When William the Conqueror's surveyors compiled the Domesday Book in 1086, they recorded roughly 40 vineyards across England. The count varies between about 38 and 46, depending on how you read the entries. Many attached to monasteries, all south of a line from Ely to Gloucestershire. And that is certainly an undercount. Within decades, Henry of Huntingdon was calling Winchester rich in wine, and William of Malmesbury described the wine of the Vale of Gloucester as abundant and good, from 2 counties where Domesday records no vineyards at all. For a few centuries, in other words, there was an English wine industry. And then it disappeared so completely that 800 years later, the phrase English wine would be used as a punchline. 2 things killed it, and the first was a marriage. In Eleanor of Aquitaine, 2 months after the end of her marriage to the King of France, married Henry Plantagenet. 2 years later, he became King of England. With her, Aquitaine passed to the English crown, and with Aquitaine, the port of Bordeaux. After that, simple economics took over. England had no wine of its own worth the trouble. Bordeaux had a port, a river, and an enormous agricultural hinterland. The crown cut duties for its own subjects in Gascony, and a flood came across the channel. In some years of the 14th century, tens of millions of liters a year went from Bordeaux to England, volumes the region would not see again for centuries. The English call this light red wine claret, pale, which is where claret comes from, the word still used in Britain for red Bordeaux. Do you see what that did to the vineyards of Kent and Gloucestershire? Why fight the English climate for thin, sour, expensive wine when a fleet can bring you better wine cheaply from land your own king owns? The second killer was the weather, the long cooling that historians call the Little Ice Age. But the first was competition from an empire England had acquired by marriage. The country stopped growing wine partly because it had become too good at getting it. And it went almost all the way down. By the 19th century, records show 8 vineyards in the whole of England. 8. Hold on to that number, because we are coming back to it at the end of this film. And what has happened since is one of the strangest reversals in this entire story. The 100 Years' War, meanwhile, was fought partly over exactly this. When the French finally took Gascony back in 1453, it was less a change of flag for Bordeaux than the loss of its main market. The English turned to Portuguese and Spanish wine instead, a decision that will echo 250 years later when port is born. Then wine went out onto the ocean, and the ocean first ruined it and then perfected it. The problem was that ordinary table wine did not survive a long voyage. Heat in the hold, the roll of the ship, imperfect seals, and after 2 months the barrel held vinegar. Ships bound for India and the Americas lost cargo every time. The answer was spirit. Add grape brandy to the barrel and the strength jumps, fermentation stops, microbes die, and the wine becomes almost impossible to kill. That is how the fortified wines were born: sherry, madeira, port. The story of Madeira reads like a joke. The Portuguese island was a perfect resupply point for ships heading to the New World, and barrels of the local fortified wine spent months rolling in the holes, heating to temperatures at which any normal wine dies. This one did not. It took on a nutty, caramelized, smoky character. Buyers acquired the taste and began demanding specifically the wine that had been round the equator. For a while, barrels were sent on pointless round-the-world voyages purely to age them. Spoiled wine became a delicacy people paid extra for. Madeira was so popular in the British colonies that, by tradition, it was Madeira the founding fathers of the United States raised to toast the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And port was born directly out of English geopolitics. When England fell out with France yet again, it needed wine from anywhere else. In 1703, the Methuen Treaty gave Portuguese wines reduced duties in Britain in exchange for free entry of English cloth into Portugal. English merchants poured into the Douro Valley, began fortifying the local wine with brandy so it would survive the journey, and created an entire industry that speaks Portuguese to this day, but carries English surnames on its labels. Almost every great style of wine was created not by a search for flavor, but by an attempt to solve a shipping problem or a customs problem. While Europe was carving up its old vineyards, the vine sailed west with the conquistadors and the friars. The reason was the same as in the early Middle Ages: no wine, no mass; no mass, no colony. As early as 1524, Hernán Cortés, as governor of New Spain, ordered Spanish settlers to plant vines, several hundred vines for every 100 indigenous people at their disposal. The phrasing alone tells you whose hands did the work. The vine moved south fast, to Peru, Chile, and Argentina, where the dry climate of the Andean foothills proved near perfect. And within a few decades, the inevitable happened. Colonial wine was cheaper than Spanish, so the Crown began restricting new planting and taxing colonial wine to protect producers at home. Precisely the move Domitian made in AD 1212. 15 centuries apart, the same logic. Let the province buy ours instead of making its own. And on the far side of the world, wine became part of a system of coercion that wine guides prefer not to mention. In 1659, Jan van Riebeek, commander of the Dutch Cape Colony, wrote in his journal that today, praise be to God, wine was made for the first time from Cape grapes. So began South African winemaking, which very quickly came to rest on the labor of enslaved people brought from Southeast Asia, Madagascar, and Mozambique. What developed there was known as the DOP system, the TOT system. Part of a worker's wages was paid in wine several times during the working day out in the fields. Cheap wine, the kind there was no one to sell to. The calculation was double: cut cash costs and bind people in whom dependency was forming. The practice outlived slavery and outlived the colonial era. It was formally banned only in the 20th century and finally in the 1990s. Its consequences are visible in rates of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in the winelands of the Western Cape, which remain among the most severe recorded anywhere. Now the most festive chapter of all, which began as a manufacturing fault. In Champagne, on the northern edge of viticulture, wine did not finish fermenting before the cold arrived. Fermentation stalled in winter. In spring, the yeasts woke up inside a sealed cask or bottle, and carbon dioxide began to build. To the winemakers of the time, this was a disaster. Bottles exploded. Cellar workers wore iron masks because one bursting bottle set off a chain reaction. The bubbles were called the devil's wine. Dom Pérignon, monk and cellarer of the Abbey of Auvilliers, genuinely was an outstanding winemaker. He improved pressing, fruit selection, and above all, blending, the art of assembling a wine from different plots. But the legend that he invented champagne and cried out that he was tasting the stars was manufactured in the 19th century for marketing purposes. For much of his career, he appears to have been fighting the bubbles rather than creating them. Sparkling wine was made possible by two things, and both of them were English. The first was strong coal-fired glass. British glassmakers fired their furnaces with coal rather than wood, reached higher temperatures, and produced a bottle that could hold several atmospheres of pressure. The second was understanding the process. And here is a fact that tends to annoy people in France. In 1662, 6 years before Pérignon even arrived at Hautevillers, an Englishman named Christopher Merritt presented a paper to the Royal Society describing how adding sugar to wine provokes a second fermentation and makes it sparkle. The method that would make Champagne the most valuable wine region on earth was written down in London first. What turned all of it into a global symbol of luxury, though, was a widow. Barbe Nicole Clicquot Ponsardin was widowed at 27, and instead of leaving the business, took over her husband's firm. It was in her cellars that riddling was perfected, gradually turning the bottle so the sediment collects at the cork and can be removed without losing the sparkle. Before that, Champagne was cloudy, and she had one gamble that settled everything. In 1814, as Napoleon fell and Allied armies stood across Europe, she sent several thousand bottles by the Baltic route at her own risk, slipping past blockades and ahead of her competitors. The bet was brilliant. The aristocracy of Russia and Central Europe met her wine and made it part of their own vocabulary of luxury. A woman to whom the law of the time granted almost nothing built one of the most recognizable brands on the planet out of a technical defect everyone else regarded as a production fault. And then came the insect we started with. We are back in 1863 in the Rhone Valley, where the vines began dying in the wake of Bordeaux' parcel. The symptoms were strange. A plant would fail with no sign of disease on the leaves, and the roots would come up swollen and rotten. The French government appointed a commission. The botanist Jules-Émile Planchon had the idea of digging up not a dead vine, but a living one at the edge of an affected plot, and found colonies of tiny yellowish insects on the roots. The American entomologist Charles Valentine Riley confirmed it, the same aphid that lives on American vines where it does no particular harm. That was the whole tragedy. American vines had grown alongside Phylloxera for millions of years and had learned to seal damaged roots with corky tissue. European Vitis vinifera, the species that makes almost all the wine in the world, had never met it and had no defense. France offered an enormous prize to anyone who could find a cure. Nobody did. Only two things worked: sandy soils where the aphid cannot survive, and grafting, taking an American root and grafting a European shoot onto it, so the fruit stays European and the root resists. That set off a genuine civil war in French wine. Opponents shouted that it was contamination, fraud, the end of authenticity, that wine grown on American roots would no longer be French. The argument ran in the newspapers, in Parliament, in the villages. There was no choice. Through the late 1880s and the 1890s, Europe grafted itself over wholesale. And today, the overwhelming majority of the world's vineyards, including the most celebrated plots in Burgundy and Bordeaux, grow on American roots. European wine survived only by fusing with the thing that was killing it. The catastrophe had a sequel that gets discussed less. While France stood without wine and demand did not disappear, the market filled with fakes. Wine was made from raisins, from water and sugar, colored with aniline dyes, diluted, relabeled. When the vineyards recovered, honest growers found themselves competing with forgers and losing. Prices fell below the cost of production. In the spring and summer of Tissac-Sam, the south of France erupted. The wine growers of the Languedoc came out into the streets, first thousands, then tens of thousands, and by June, a crowd contemporaries estimated in the hundreds of thousands gathered at Montpellier. Mayors resigned, whole communes refused to pay tax. People were killed when a demonstration was broken up at Narbonne. And then the thing the government feared most happened. Soldiers of the 17th Infantry Regiment, recruited from those same villages, refused to fire on their own and marched off with their weapons to Béziers. That revolt is the direct cause of something that now looks like timeless French elegance. The state was finally forced to define what real wine was and where it was entitled to come from. Out of that came the laws of origin, and in 1738, the system of controlled appellations and the institute that runs it. Appellations are not an inheritance from the monks or a whim of connoisseurs. They are the result of mass fraud and a revolt by hungry people. The 20th century brought wine two things it had never known on that scale: total prohibition by a state and total war. On 16 January 1728, Prohibition came into force in the United States, and something nobody had planned for happened. Vineyard acreage in California did not fall during the dry years, it multiplied. The secret was a loophole permitting the head of a household to make up to 200 gallons of fruit juice a year. Growers sold pressed blocks of concentrate, wine bricks, with instructions written in magnificent legal bad faith. Dissolve in a gallon of water, and whatever you do, do not leave the liquid in a dark cupboard for 20 days, because it will turn into wine. The second loophole was 2,000 years older. The law did not dare touch sacramental wine. The real cost was paid in quality. Vineyards switched to thick-skinned varieties that survived rail transport across a continent rather than the ones that made good wine. When Prohibition was repealed in 1733, American winemaking woke up set back by decades. In Europe, wine went to the front. The French army issued a daily ration, the famous Pinard, 3/4 liter a day by the end of the First World War. And in the Second World War, the German Occupation Administration appointed purchasing officials to the wine regions of France, nicknamed the Weinführers. Officially, they bought wine. In practice, they shipped it out by the wagon load at prices they set themselves. Growers in Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne bricked up their best sellers behind false walls, aged the fresh mortar with cobwebs and dust, and hid bottles under manure. Some of those caches were not opened until after the liberation. In a country short of food and medicine, people risked their lives to hide glass bottles, because what was being taken was not property, but a region's memory of itself. Then France lost its monopoly in a single afternoon in its own capital. On 24 May 1776, the English wine merchant Stephen Spurrier, who ran a shop and a school in Paris, staged a tasting for the American bicentennial. The idea was largely promotional. Compare a few Californian wines with French benchmarks. The judges were 9 respected French experts. The tasting was blind, bottles wrapped in paper, no names. Exactly one journalist turned up, George Tabor of Time. When the scores were counted, Californians had taken first place in both categories. The 1773 Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena ahead of the best white Burgundies, and the 1773 Cabernet from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars ahead of Mouton Rothschild and Haut-Brion. The winning winery had been founded 6 years earlier. Its competitors had been making wine for 3 centuries. The French press barely noticed at first. Tabor's few paragraphs in Time turned the world market over. Great wine, it emerged, was not tied to French geography. Both bottles now sit in the collection of the Smithsonian. After that, the market went global and very quickly found a new master. Not a king and not a monastery, but an American lawyer named Robert Parker, who began rating wines on a 100-point scale. A single number proved more powerful than any description. 95 points and an estate sells the whole vintage. 85 and it is underwater. Winemakers around the world began making wine to suit the palate of one man and his followers. Riper, denser, oakier. The phenomenon even acquired a name, Parkerization. Power over wine had not disappeared. It had simply moved from the royal chancery into a column of scores. And in 1985, the story came full circle back to Roman lead. That summer, laboratories in West Germany testing sweet Austrian white wines found diethylene glycol in them, a component of antifreeze. It had been added to make cheap wine seem sweeter and fuller so it could pass as expensive, and the standard sugar tests of the day did not reveal it. The scandal destroyed the industry in weeks. Tens of millions of liters were recalled and destroyed, some burned in cement kilns because ordinary treatment plants could not cope with the substance. Exports fell by roughly a factor of 10, and the reputation took over a decade to rebuild. Austria responded with one of the strictest wine laws in the world, which is precisely why its wines are respected today. 2,000 years and the same script. Cheap wine, a toxic additive that makes it taste sweet, and a buyer who cannot tell the difference. Now let us look at what has become of all this, and why the history of wine is turning, right now, somewhere it has never been. Wine has stopped growing, for the first time in its recorded history. According to the International Organization of Vine and Wine, world production fell in 2024 to its lowest level in more than 60 years, and in 2025 came only slightly off that floor, around 227 million hectoliters. World consumption is about 208 million hectoliters, and that is the fourth consecutive year of decline. The area under vine on the planet has been shrinking for 6 years and now stands at roughly 7 million hectares. Two separate processes sit behind those numbers. The first is climate. France in 2020 brought in its smallest harvest since 22nd Sem. Spain's was the lowest in 30 years. Growers in southern Europe are dealing with things their grandparents never saw. Frost in April with the buds already open. 40 degrees during ripening. Downpours followed by rot. This is not a bad year. This is the new normal. And the vine is crawling north. Which is where this story comes back to those 8 vineyards. England today has more than 1,100 registered vineyards. The area under vine has grown by roughly 500% since 2005 to somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 hectares, concentrated in Kent, Sussex, and now Essex, on chalk that is geologically the same seam that runs under Champagne. The 2025 harvest produced the equivalent of about 16.5 million bottles, up more than half on the previous year, and roughly 7 bottles in 10 are sparkling. Champagne houses have quietly bought land in southern England. Read those numbers against the Domesday Book. 40 vineyards in 1086, 8 in the 19th century, over 1,100 now. The boundary that the Little Ice Age pushed south is coming back, and it is coming back along exactly the same road in the opposite direction. The second process is people. Younger generations in wealthy countries drink noticeably less than their parents did. Medicine has played its part. On 4th January 2023, the WHO stated that there is no safe level of alcohol consumption. The risk begins with the first drop, and wine is no better than anything else. The French paradox, the glass of red for your heart, on which the industry built decades of advertising, is not supported by current evidence. The business remains vast. Nearly half of all wine produced crosses a border, but much of what sits on a supermarket shelf is blended by a handful of corporations from enormous lots to hit a price bracket and a mass palate. And here is the real reversal. For 8,000 years, wine was scarce. None of this history, the slaves traded for an amphora, the lead syrup, the edicts and monopolies, the revolts and the forgeries, would have happened if there had been enough of it. Today, for the first time globally, the problem runs the other way. There is more wine than there are people willing to drink it. European governments now pay growers to pull vines out and distill the surplus into industrial spirit. Power over wine has not vanished, it has changed hands again. It once belonged to whoever owned the slope or the port, then to whoever assigned the scores. Now it belongs to a supermarket buyer deciding whether your bottle makes the range, and to a climate deciding whether there is a harvest at all. So what do we see, standing back 8,000 years and looking at the whole road at once? Wine is a perfect index of human nature, precisely because it is not necessary. Without salt, the body dies. Without bread, it dies. Without wine, it does not. And yet this is the thing for which children were sold into slavery, aristocracies were poisoned, fleets were launched, laws were written, and uprisings were raised. We are capable of building an entire economy around something we could perfectly well live without, provided we can persuade ourselves it means more than it is. And one more thing. What looks permanent and deeply rooted is almost always younger and more fragile than it appears. Timeless French tradition stands on American roots grafted on after a catastrophe. The ancient appellations were born from the revolt of Tisaccia de Viazzot-Sim. Champagne was a manufacturing fault. Madeira was spoiled cargo. And English wine, written into the Domesday Book and then wiped out by cold weather and a royal marriage, has come back after 800 years because the climate changed. Think about that the next time you read the word tradition on a label. Think about the fact that behind every great style stands somebody's accident or somebody's customs house. Think about how many bottles in this story cost someone far too much. And think about how many people across 8,000 years buried jars in the earth, bricked barrels behind false walls, and refused to fire on their own, over a liquid they could simply have chosen not to drink. So the next time you pick up a glass at dinner, hold your hand there for a second. You are holding the only thing on your table that has been, all at once, a currency, a medicine, a poison, a border between civilizations, and the blood of a god. If you made it this far, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which moment surprised you most. The Gauls trading a person for an amphora, the Roman sugar of lead, or the fact that England used to be a wine country and is quietly becoming one again. There are many more stories like this coming.